Bands look like friendships from the outside. 5 faces on an album cover, arms around each other, sharing a van and a hotel room and a bar tab. Then something goes wrong inside the group, and the music stops for good. So today, we're looking at the 10 worst bandmates of the 1970s who ruined bands. Number 10. Sly Stone of Sly and the Family Stone. At the start of the decade, no band in America looked more like the future. Sly and the Family Stone were black and white, men and women, playing something nobody had heard before, and they had just stopped a Woodstock crowd in its tracks. Then the shows started disappearing. By 1970, Sly Stone was missing roughly a third of the band's dates, reportedly canceling 26 of 80 engagements that year, while a stack of unfinished recordings piled up, and his record label executives fielded questions they couldn't answer. One label man later described the pattern simply, Sly would book studio time and not turn up. On July 27, 1970, the band was scheduled to play a free show at Grant Park in Chicago, a make-good for concerts they had already canceled in the city. Somewhere between 35 and 50,000 people waited. Sly didn't appear on stage, the crowd turned, and the afternoon ended in a riot that injured well over 100 people and spilled into the Loop. Chicago's mayor canceled rock concerts in city parks. Promoters everywhere took notice, and the band's touring life never fully recovered from that single afternoon. Stone had also brought in a new circle of minders and hangers-on who handled his affairs and shielded him from people he had decided were enemies, a list that came to include his own band. Drummer Greg Errico walked out in early 1971. Bassist Larry Graham, whose playing had helped define the sound, was gone by the following year. The band held together in name until a poorly attended show in January 1975 ended it. Stone kept releasing records under the name, and none of them landed. There was a second cost, too. The band that had put a woman on trumpet and a white drummer on stage in 1968 and made that look like the natural order of things stopped being an argument for anything once it stopped being a band. Nobody replaced it. He wrote about that period himself in a memoir published in 2023, describing a shadow falling over the country and something leaking out of it. He died in June 2025, aged 82, with a catalog everyone still borrows from and a band that never got its second act. Number 9. Rod Stewart of Faces. The Faces were built on the idea that nobody was the star. They came out of the wreckage of the Small Faces, added Rod Stewart and Ronnie Wood, and became one of the best live bands in the world. Loose, funny, half-drunk, and enormous fun. The problem arrived almost immediately. Stewart had a solo contract with a different label, and in 1971, his own album Every Picture Tells a Story, and the single Maggie May went to number 1 in both Britain and America. Overnight, the frontman of a Democratic band was a genuine solo star, and the group's own records began to look like a side project. Resentment followed. Bandmates suspected he was keeping his best songs for his own albums. An accusation Stewart has denied. Ronnie Lane, the bassist, co-founder, and by most accounts the soul of the group, grew tired of being a sideman with limited chances to sing, and quit in June 1973 after their 4th and final studio album. Stewart himself has been fairly candid about what that cost. He has said the band lost its heart when Lane left, and admitted that in those years everyone was young, rich, and not paying attention to the details. Concert billing started reading like the truth of the situation. Rod Stewart and the Faces. When Wood took the job with the Rolling Stones in 1975, the last thread went with him. Stewart announced his departure that December, and it was over. Lane went on to a modest solo career, made a fine album with Pete Townshend, and was later diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. He died in 1997. Kenny Jones joined The Who after Keith Moon's death. Ian McLagan spent decades as one of the most respected sidemen in rock. There is a detail that sums the whole thing up. On the recording of Maggie May, the song that broke the arrangement, the mandolin was played by a member of another band entirely, Ray Jackson of Lindisfarne, and the Faces weren't on it at all. The band whose singer was selling millions of records wasn't playing on them. Everyone involved has been generous about it since, and Stewart has repeatedly said the Faces were the most fun he ever had. But the arithmetic of one member's solo success against 4 other careers is hard to argue with. Stay Number 8. Richie Blackmore of Deep Purple. By 1972, Deep Purple's Mark II lineup had made Machine Head and were arguably the loudest, biggest band on the planet. Within a year and a half, they had torn themselves apart, and most accounts point to one man's insistence on running things. Guitarist Richie Blackmore and singer Ian Gillan had stopped speaking. During the making of the album Who Do We Think We Are, bassist Roger Glover has said, "The two didn't exchange a word," leaving Glover as the go-between while trying to produce a record. Gillan later said his reason for leaving was the band drifting toward commercial fashion and pointed at Blackmore as the one steering it there. Glover's account of what happened next is blunt. Blackmore, he has said, had begun behaving as though nobody else in the band existed and wanted to be its leader outright. When Gillan sent his resignation letter, the rest expected somebody to talk him out of it. Nobody did. Blackmore then contemplated leaving himself and taking drummer Ian Pace with him. Management intervened and Blackmore agreed to stay on one condition: Glover had to go. Glover has described it as a stab in the back and said he was told plainly that fresh blood was needed and that he shouldn't take it personally. He called himself the sacrificial lamb. The last Mark II show was in Osaka on June 29, 1973. To be fair to Blackmore, he has said he never actually wanted to get rid of Glover, and that his plan had been to leave and form a trio. It's worth noting that nobody has ever questioned the man's playing. The riff on Smoke on the Water is his, and organist John Lord, who spent years absorbing the fallout, described Gillan's resignation letter as a dreadful shame, and said he'd have preferred him to stay and fight from inside. The band carried on with David Coverdale and Glenn Hughes made some good records, and then Blackmore quit anyway in 1975 to form Rainbow. Deep Purple limped on with the young American guitarist Tommy Bolin and folded in July 1976, 8 years after they started. It took 8 years and the same 5 men to put it back together. Number 7. Johnny Thunders of the New York Dolls. The New York Dolls invented a large part of what punk would become, and they were finished before punk arrived. 2 albums, neither of them a hit, and a reputation with radio and record companies that ranged from indifference to hostility. The internal problem was heroin. Guitarist Johnny Thunders and drummer Jerry Nolan had both developed serious addictions, which disrupted rehearsals and recordings, while bassist Arthur Kane was drinking heavily. On one occasion in late 1974, when the band booked a New York studio to cut a single, only 2 members turned up in a condition to record. Thunders didn't turn up at all. Their label dropped them. In January 1975, a young London clothing shop owner named Malcolm McLaren arrived, took over informally, and tried to relaunch them. He found them a rehearsal loft and, by guitarist Sylvain's account, genuinely tried to get Thunders and Nolan into rehab and Kane detoxed. He also dressed the band in red patent leather and hung a hammer and sickle flag behind them in America, with the Vietnam War still going. Sylvain has called it the most kamikaze thing they could have done. Singer David Johansen was less charitable about McLaren generally, describing the band at that point as an ungovernable force. The end came in the spring of 1975 on a run of dates in Florida, where the shows collapsed and the audience turned. Thunders and Nolan quit on the spot and went home to New York to form the Heartbreakers with Richard Hell, leaving the Dolls without a rhythm section or a future. Sylvain and Johansen tried to keep something going with hired players for a while, touring Japan under the name, and it never took. The Dolls had been together roughly 3 years. The cruel part is the timing. Within 18 months of the split, the scene the Dolls had effectively designed, the look, the noise, the attitude, was the most talked about thing in music, and the band that started it wasn't there for any of it. Thunders spent the rest of his career as an enormously influential guitarist and a cautionary tale, dying in New Orleans in 1991 at 38. Nolan died the following year. McLaren went home to London with a very clear idea of what to do next, and did it with the Sex Pistols. Number 6. Robbie Robertson of the band. This one comes with a warning. Almost every detail is disputed, and both men are now gone. So what follows is what each side said. The band ended as a touring group on Thanksgiving night, 1976 at Winterland in San Francisco. A farewell concert with Bob Dylan, Muddy Waters, Joni Mitchell, Neil Young, and Van Morrison. Filmed by Martin Scorsese and released as The Last Waltz. Guitarist Robbie Robertson, the group's principal songwriter, was the one who wanted off the road, and at the time his stated plan was to stop touring but keep making records. Drummer Levon Helm never forgave him. In his 1993 memoir, he laid the breakup squarely at Robertson's door and made a series of hard accusations. That Robertson had taken songwriting credit that belonged to the whole group, that he had engineered the split to serve his own plans, and that the film had been shaped with Scorsese to present him as the leader. Helm mocked the lingering close-ups of Robertson's face in the film and said he hated the whole thing. Robertson's version was that he wrote the songs, that Helm sang them better than anyone alive, and that the story had simply calcified. In 2021, he called it sad, saying Helm had decided he'd hijack the band's narrative and never let it go. What isn't disputed is the outcome. The five of them played together once more in March 1978 for a 3-song encore at a Rick Danko show. In 1983, the other four went back on the road as the band, pointedly without Robertson, and never worked with him again. Their road manager's recollection, quoted in Helm's book, complicates the picture in Helm's favor on one point. When the group was deciding whether to keep touring with Bob Dylan years earlier, it was Helm who insisted nobody in the band get left behind. Richard Manuel died in 1986. Danko died in 1999. Helm died in 2012, and Robertson visited him in his final days. Robertson died in 2023. Number 5. Sid Vicious of the Sex Pistols. The Sex Pistols had a competent bass player. His name was Glenn Matlock. He co-wrote most of the songs on the only album they made, and he was out of the band by February 1977. Partly, it seems, because the rest of them felt he didn't fit the picture. His replacement was John Simon Ritchie, a friend of the singer, renamed Sid Vicious. He looked exactly right, which was the point. He also couldn't play. He had asked Lemmy of Motorhead to teach him, and the lessons hadn't got far. The consequences showed up on the record. On Nevermind the Bollocks, Vicious appears on 2 tracks. Guitarist Steve Jones played most of the bass parts himself. Jones has described the sessions as a nightmare, explaining that Vicious kept trying to play power chords, which isn't a thing you can do on a bass. Then came Nancy Spungen, Heroin, and a band that no longer functioned as a band. Rather than tour Europe, manager Malcolm McLaren sent them through the American South in January 1978 into venues chosen for maximum friction. Vicious was in visible trouble throughout. Singer John Lydon watched the group turn into a spectacle he despised. It ended on stage at Winterland in San Francisco on January 14, 1978. Lydon asked the audience whether they felt cheated, put down the microphone, and walked off. The Sex Pistols were done after roughly 2 years and 1 album. Vicious was charged with Spungen's murder in October 1978 and died of a heroin overdose on February 2, 1979, before the case was resolved. He was 21 and had been a professional musician for less than 2 years. McLaren had reportedly tried to get Matlock back once it became clear how little his replacement could play, and had even offered to pay him to play on the album. By then, Matlock had moved on. Matlock, meanwhile, formed the Rich Kids, has toured with the reformed Pistols in later decades, and remains the answer to the question of what the band might have sounded like with a bass player in it. Number 4. Peter Criss of Kiss. At the start of the 1978, Kiss were as big as it got. The makeup, the boots, the arenas, the lunchboxes. By the end of the 1979, the original 4 had played their last show together for 17 years. Drummer Peter Criss and guitarist Ace Frehley had both signaled they wanted out in 1978. Instead of splitting, the band took a break and released 4 simultaneous solo albums, then reconvened for Dynasty in 1979. Criss barely appears on it. He had injured his hands in a car accident, and producer Vinnie Poncia decided his drumming wasn't up to standard, an assessment Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley shared. They quietly hired session drummer Anton Fig, who played every track except one, uncredited, while Criss stayed on the sleeve and went out on the tour. Simmons later said flatly that Criss was largely out of commission through drugs and alcohol and wasn't being kind to the people around him. The tour was worse. Attendance dropped noticeably, and after an onstage argument with Stanley, Criss deliberately dragged the tempos down mid-show. A piece of sabotage, the band came very close to firing him over on the spot. The final show of the original lineup was in Toledo on December 16th, 1979. Criss has written that he and Simmons shook hands afterward and that he knew it was finished. He was gone the following year, replaced by Eric Carr, and Fig played the whole of the next album too, again uncredited, while Criss appeared in the artwork and a music video. Frehley left in 1982, and the group that had built its entire identity on 4 characters and makeup had lost half of them inside 3 years. The band's recovery took years. The albums that followed the split sold poorly by Kiss standards. The makeup came off in 1983, and it took until the 1996 reunion tour, Original 4, full costume, for the machine to run at that scale again. Criss came back twice in 1996 and again in 2002, and each stint ended badly, the first, by his own account, over money. Number 3. Joe Perry of Aerosmith. By 1979, Aerosmith had been running at full speed for most of the decade, and the machinery was shot. They were meant to be recording Night in the Ruts, and went out on tour during a break in the sessions instead. Perry later described the situation plainly. Rather than taking a holiday, they let loose on each other. The pattern was petty and constant. Bassist Tom Hamilton described Steven Tyler doing something to annoy Joe Perry, then Perry pointedly freezing Tyler out on stage, obviously enough for the audience to notice. Guitarist Brad Whitford later compared being in the band to walking into a dogfight where both dogs bite you. It came apart on July 28, 1979. Backstage at the World Series of Rock at Cleveland Municipal Stadium. A bill that also included AC/DC, Journey, Ted Nugent, and Thin Lizzy. Hamilton's wife Terry made a remark to Perry's wife Alyssa. Alyssa threw a glass of milk at her. The two of them ended up in a physical fight loud enough for the band to hear from another room, and while Perry and Hamilton were pulling them apart, Tyler told Perry to control his woman. Perry quit that night. Guitarist Jimmy Crespo replaced him in October. Whitford left in 1981. Tyler collapsed on stage in Maine in 1980, and the band spent the early 80s in freefall playing to half-empty rooms while their old records kept selling. Perry has always been clear that the milk wasn't really the cause. He said that if he had stayed, the same thing would have happened anyway. Tyler put it more simply, marveling years later that the biggest American rock band of the 70s split up over a glass of spilled milk. Whitford's departure 2 years later made the point that this wasn't a two-man problem. By 1981 half, the band that had made Toys in the Attic and Rocks was gone, and the version still touring was carrying a name it hadn't earned. They patched it up in 1984, and the reunion turned out to be one of the great second acts in rock, but 5 years went into the hole first. Number 2. Ozzy Osbourne of Black Sabbath. They had grown up a few streets apart in Birmingham, invented heavy metal more or less by accident, and spent 10 years making each other rich. Then, on April the 27th, 1979, Black Sabbath fired their singer. The immediate reason was that no work was getting done. The band had rented a house in Los Angeles to write the follow-up to Never Say Die, converted the garage into a studio, and started jamming. And Ozzy Osbourne vanished for weeks. Tony Iommi has said Osbourne was out at clubs, not coming home, and that when he did return, he was in no condition to sing. Iommi kept asking him to redo vocals. Warner Brothers kept asking how the album was coming. Iommi kept saying it was going great, with nothing to play them. Earlier, on tour behind Never Say Die, Osbourne had overslept and missed a show in Nashville altogether, and the crowd tore the place up. They sent Bill Ward to deliver the news because Ward was Osbourne's closest friend in the band, and, as Osbourne put it, wasn't exactly the firing type. Osbourne's own memory of the message was that Iommi thought he was a coked-up loser wasting everyone's time. He has never entirely accepted the verdict, and he had a point worth hearing. All four of them were in trouble with drink and drugs at that stage, and he was the one who got sacked for it. He called that hypocritical and noted that they weren't a manufactured group whose members were interchangeable. They were four blokes from the same town. Geezer Butler said Osbourne couldn't believe it, and that the rest of them at least had each other. There is also a precedent people forget. In 1977, Ward had briefly fired Geezer Butler for seeming disengaged, then reinstated him a fortnight later with a phone call. Firing a member wasn't unthinkable in that band. Making it stick was new. What followed was one of the better endings on this list. Sharon Arden managed Osbourne into an enormous solo career. Sabbath recruited Ronnie James Dio and made Heaven and Hell. Osbourne died in July 2025 at 76, weeks after a farewell show with Sabbath in Birmingham. Number 1. Roger Waters of Pink Floyd. Nobody on this list ended a band more decisively, and nobody did it with more paperwork. By 1979, Pink Floyd were four men who had been together since the mid-60s, and The Wall was Roger Waters' project, a concept album about isolation that left very little room for anybody else's ideas. Keyboardist Rick Wright, going through a divorce and by his own admission, not in a productive stretch creatively, became the target. Waters demanded he leave, reportedly threatening to pull the plug on the album if he didn't. David Gilmour and Nick Mason didn't fight hard enough to stop it. Wright resigned, or was fired, depending on whose account you take, and the four of them never recorded an album together again. The next record, The Final Cut, is the only Pink Floyd album without him. Then came the strangest part. Wright agreed to play the 1980 and 1981 Wall shows as a salaried musician. And because the staging was so expensive that the tour lost money, he became the only member of Pink Floyd to earn anything from it. Mason has made the joke himself. The salaried man got paid, the three owners split the losses. On the road, the four of them traveled in separate vehicles, with Waters staying in different hotels entirely. He wasn't finished. Waters quit in 1985 and went to court to try to stop Gilmour and Mason from using the name, arguing the band was a spent force. He lost. Wright came back, first as a hired hand, eventually as a full member again by 1994. Waters has never softened much on the subject, saying as late as the late 80s that Wright had been burnt out since 1979, and that firing him had been unanimous. Wright's own summary was gracious and a little sad. He said he hadn't wanted to walk out on something he'd spent his life building, so he went out and played as well as he could, half hoping the decision might be reversed. Wright died in 2008. The four of them shared a stage exactly once more, at Live 8 in 2005, and by then the man who'd been fired was a full member again, and the man who'd fired him was the one on the outside. Before you go, 10 bands, 10 breaking points, and in most cases, everyone involved has spent decades telling a slightly different version of the same night. It's worth remembering that these were mostly men in their 20s with no experience of money or fame, being asked to run a business with their friends. If you enjoyed this one, do us a favor. Hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tap the bell so the next one finds you. And tell us in the comments which breakup still stings the most, or which bandmate you think has been unfairly blamed all these years.